Welcome everyone. So good to be together. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Today is the last session of Halakhah for the Ages, reading Responsa from a Bygone era with Dr. Rachel Furst. I know it's meant as a question, Halakhah for the Ages, but I always read it wrong. And just a reminder that you'll be receiving an invitation to become a panelist from me. That just means that it will allow you to unmute and participate in class, ask questions. Of course, you can then choose to keep your video on or off. The other thing is when you're not actively speaking, please stay muted so we don't have background noise. And I'll help mute you. So then just remember to unmute when you are speaking. You can also engage in writing here on the chat on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook if you're with us. Welcome to you as well. And with that, I'll turn it to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you so much for that invitation, Evie, and welcome to all of the returnees, and welcome to anyone who might be joining for the first time. This is our final class of this series. And in this final class of our series, as I mentioned last week, what I'd like to do is first, we're going to be returning to the main source text that we discussed, the main responsum that we discussed last week, which is why, as Evie mentioned, the source sheet from last week is back in the chat. Some of you will have already received it and should have it from last week. We're also going to be looking at a series of responses to that initial halachic ruling that we encountered last week. Different approaches to the question, and I'll get to that in just a moment. And finally, towards the end of the session today, I'd like to, again, since this is our last class of this series, I'd like to use this last responsum or responsa as a window for thinking about some of the bigger issues that we addressed in this course. And that question that Evie just posed as per the title of the class, Halakhah for the Ages. Are these responsa that we've been studying, which have been located in time and in place in medieval Ashkenaz, primarily in the 12th and the 13th century in German-speaking lands of many centuries past, what is in fact their significance for halakhah throughout the ages for the long term? So we'll return to those questions a little bit later. What I'd like to start out with today, and I'm going to interrupt myself for just one moment. I apologize. I just want to close my window so that there's no background noise here. As some of you may know, I'm speaking from Israel, where it has suddenly gotten very warm, so the window was left open. Okay, so what we're going to do, again, I'm just to kind of recap and remind you what we were discussing last week. I'd like to, for a moment, put back onto the screen the text that we studied last week, so last week's short source sheet. Just one moment, please. Let me get that up. Sorry, one second. I apologize. For some reason, I'm having trouble getting that up. One moment, please. Bear with me.
Feel free to let me know if you need my help.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I apologize. It's always frustrating when this happens, but for some reason, this will take me just one extra moment. Apologies. Okay. Let me try that. Let me try that share one final time. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is what you see in front of you here. This is last week's source sheet. So just to, again, remind you and recap, we examined together a responsum that had been written. It appears, as you can see here, in Sefer Or Zarua, It had been written by Rabbi Isaac ben Moses Orzara, who is one of the very important German German Jewish halachists, and specifically writers, authors of Responsa, as well as other halachic works like the Sefer Orzara itself, in the middle of the 13th century. Rabbi Isaac Orzara probably died sometime between 1260 and 1270. We know that this specific responsum was written in direct response to events that occurred in Frankfurt in 1241. So we can, date this responsum pretty accurately. And we saw last week that Rabbi Isaac, that he's responding here, as he says at the beginning, on the matter of a young woman who was coerced while she was betrothed. But of course, that's only kind of the subheading of a much more complicated story. You may recall, as we discussed last week, and the reason that I'm repeating this again is because it's going to be very relevant to the new texts that we're going to see today, that the incident itself that occurred in Frankfurt was in the context of some very violent anti-Jewish riots directed at the Jewish community that really destroyed the Jewish community of Frankfurt at the time. Roughly 200 people were killed, 200 Jews were killed in those riots, and the survivors of those riots, roughly 25 people, were taken captive by local Christians and forcibly converted to Christianity. Among those individuals, among those survivors, was a young woman who had been, prior to the events in question, she had been betrothed. That is, she had been formally engaged with Kiddushin, so it had Halakhic status, to a young man who was not caught up in the riots, who did not live in the community of Frankfurt, but rather in a relatively nearby community of Würzburg. And we'll take a look at the map again in just a moment. This young woman was held in captivity for several months, in the course of which the intended groom had approached Rabbi Isaac Orzara, among other scholars in his hometown of Würzburg, that's where Isaac Orzara was living at the time, and had asked for permission to marry, essentially cancel his betrothal, to marry another woman instead of that, the captive bride, because he insisted that she would be forbidden to him on account of her captivity. And last week we took a look at some of the Talmudic texts, primarily Mishnayot from Tractate Ketubot, that provide the halachic background, explaining why it is, what is the logic there, why it is that he believed she would be prohibited to him, that is unable to proceed with their marriage, even after she might come out of captivity. Rabbi Isaac Orzara initially told the young man that he had to wait, that he was not allowed to marry anyone else in the interim. This young man defied Rabbi Isaac Orzara and went ahead and married someone else. Apparently, the brothers of this young woman, and perhaps other supporters or other family members, when she finally did manage to escape her captors, again, several months later, they apparently took this whole incident to a series of rabbinic scholars. First, a number of scholars in the Rhineland, that is the communities of Mainz and Speyer and Worms, which was really the heart of the German Jewish community at the time. And subsequently to Rabbi Isaac himself. Rabbi Isaac himself, at that point, after the woman had already escaped her captivity, at that point, Rabbi Isaac Orzara ruled incredibly stringently and, in fact, sided with the groom in insisting that this young woman was prohibited to continue with her marriage. She was prohibited to her original betrothed. And the reason that he gave was he understood her to be in the category of nechbesha, or imprisoned woman. And we'll take a look at that Mishnah again so that you understand that, because it will be, again, relevant to our discussion today. He understood her to be in that particular halacha category. He understood her to be in a subcategory of women who are imprisoned in conjunction with some kind of capital crime. And the understanding of the Talmudic texts is that a woman who is imprisoned in conjunction with some sort of capital crime that either she or perhaps her husband has committed basically has given up or is desperate for her life, and in her desperation is assumed not only to submit to any sort of sexual favors or sexual violence that might have been imposed upon her by her captors, but is assumed halachically to even initiate sexual contact with her captors as a bid for her life. And that's really where the prohibition stemmed, because a woman, a married woman, and again, this betrothed woman, because she had already had kiddushin, was for all practical purposes as if married. A married woman who initiates sexual contact with a man other than her husband is considered a zona in halachic terms. I don't want to translate that as prostitute, but as a licentious woman. And in that instance, or on that understanding, she is in fact prohibited halachically from maintaining a relationship, a sexual relationship with her husband. And we discussed last week some of the implications of that, the difficulties of that ruling, but also some of the motivations, some of the reasons that Rabbi Isaac or Zarua adopted that particular approach. We took a look at these Mishnayot that I mentioned to understand what motivated his ruling from an interpretive perspective. And I also began to show you that in addition to the interpretive, the understanding of the Talmudic texts that might have motivated his reading, that the language he uses to describe this woman and her actions and the assumptions that he made legally, halachically, about her actions suggest that there was something deeper at stake, not merely an interpretive stance on the Talmudic texts themselves, but also a reading, and I'm going to call it for now a political reading of the contemporary historical context, the specific case before him. And I want to remind you also that I pointed out to you how, in terms of the sort of the rhetoric that Rabbi Isaac or Zarua uses, if we read this responsum with a literary eye, we can see that he uses words like coerced, which in Hebrew is ne'eneset, ne'ensa, anusa, variations on that word, which in its Hebrew halachic context can mean alternatively coerced sexually or coerced religiously. In this particular case, both of those meanings bore significance, because we're talking about a woman who was forcibly baptized, so she was coerced religiously, but who also had about whom there is also this discussion, or there were certainly concerns about sexual contact that she might have had with her captors. So there's also this question of sexual coercion. Rabbi Isaac or Zarua really played with that terminology in several cases, to, in my mind at least, sometimes perhaps intentionally obscure the precise meaning of the term ne'eneset. Was he talking about religious coercion? Was he talking about sexual coercion? I think in his mind, the two were very closely conflated in this particular case, suggesting that the sexual violation, at least symbolically, stood in for the religious violation and vice versa, which gives us the sense that he was that he really saw this particular incident as one that had significance beyond the individual woman in question or the individual couple in question, one that had significance for the community as a whole. A violated individual, to some extent, I want to suggest, in his mind, really threatened the boundaries or the sanctity of the community a little bit more broadly. I think that that's really that's the tone of his responsum, and I think that it's probably the best way to understand why he ruled so stringently on a technical level, but also why the language that he used to express his ruling, to express his prohibition, was really so rife and so rough. That's what I believe is part of what's going on there. But in order to convince you perhaps a little bit further of this kind of reading, as I mentioned, what I'd like to do now is to take a look at some of the other scholars who, as I mentioned, also weighed in on this very specific, very same case. Right? This was enough of this was clearly a case that attracted scholarly attention beyond Rabbi Isaac Or Zarah himself. And again, as I said beforehand, part of that was the product of a conscious attempt on the part of this young woman's brothers and other supporters to garner support for her after she returned from captivity. And as we discussed last week, probably part of the reason they were so desperate to get rabbinic support was because on a social level, this young woman didn't have too many options other than to proceed with her original marriage. The stigma of having been taken captive, of having come into such intimate contact with her Christian attackers and captors was significant and probably precluded the possibility of other matches or other marriages. And so they really managed to pull into the fray a whole bunch of additional scholars. Some of those scholars, just in case this wasn't clear in what I said before, some of the scholars had actually written responsa prior to Rabbi Isaac Or Zarah. Right? And if you might remember that last week, we read Rabbi Isaac's account of how the brothers came to him and didn't want to show him the other responsa, and he asked to see them, and they only let him see them eventually on Shabbat just before he was eating for a very short and brief amount of time, and so he couldn't really direct his response to theirs. But we do actually have, I don't know if we have all of the responsa that were originally written in support of this woman. We do have 5 additional responsa to the one by Isaac Or Zarah that we read together. 3 of the responsa that we have that have survived were written prior to Isaac Or Zarah's ruling, and they all came out in support of the woman. In other words, they all, in contrast to Isaac Or Zarah, ruled that this woman was perfectly permitted to her original groom. She could continue with her marriage proceedings. And if the young man had gone off and married another woman in the interim, that he was obligated to issue a divorce for her, so at the very least she would not be left in aguna. And we have 2 more responsa that were written after Isaac Or Zarah issued his prohibition, and that directly engage with his prohibition and really very sharply reject that prohibition. I also want to say that the other scholars who responded, again, Isaac Or Zarah was sitting in Würzburg, the other scholars were in the Rhineland at the time. And to make a little bit of sense of this, I'm going to stop the share in front of us, and I'm going to now turn to my PowerPoint. Just one moment, please. Geez, this will take just nice. Hold on a second. Okay, let me get this PowerPoint up. Okay, here we go. Okay, so again, just so that you have the geographical parameters in mind, we're talking about this incident that occurred in Frankfurt, which you can see circled in red. And we're talking about a halachic dispute that occurred thereafter in Würzburg, which is also circled in red. So you can see that those 2 communities are fairly close to one another. And you can probably also see on the map, just slightly to the west of Frankfurt, to the southwest of Frankfurt, you can probably see the communities of Worms and Speyer that are marked there. And you can see, well, actually, I should say Mainz and Worms and Speyer, they're all towns along the Rhine River, which is, why I refer to them as the Rhineland communities. That's where the other scholars were weighing in. So we're talking about a fairly local dispute, but one that really pulled in some heavyweight scholars. And so it, even at the time, the fact that all of these scholars were weighing in on this particular incident suggests that they understood it to have real halachic import, and probably social significance, as well. Again, to remind you of our timeline, again, I apologize that because we don't know the exact date of Isaac or Zerah's death, I didn't mark him here, but he, as I said, he died probably around 1160, 1170. And again, we're talking about an incident that occurred in the final century that I have marked here in 1241. We're going to see in just a moment that the remainder of, or I shouldn't say the remainder, but 3 of the 5 additional responsa that were written on this case were actually preserved in the writings in the Responsa collection of Isaac or Zerah's son Chaim ben Isaac or Zerah. You can see marked there. At the end of our timeline, we've seen some responsa by him. He, as was very typical of Ashkenazi scholars, included in his responsa compilation not only his own authored pieces, but also pieces authored by some of his predecessors. And I guess he felt at the time that these responsa that had been sent to his father were significant and worthy of preserving, but perhaps had not been preserved or included in other collections. So he included them in his own. Again, interesting insofar as all of those respondents clashed with his father. In Rabbi Chaim ben Isaac's compilation, he includes 2 of the responsa that were written prior to his father's ruling, and one responsum that we're about to take a look at together that was written directly in response to his father, and that again rejected his father's approach. That responsum is authored, I'm going to skip forward for just a moment, by a scholar by the name that, again, that responsum that Chaim or Zerah included, which was sent to his father in rejection of his father's stringent approach, was authored by a scholar named David ben Shealtiel. And David ben Shealtiel, again, from the Rhineland communities, he rejected, we're going to read it together, he rejected Rabbi Isaac's ruling on several grounds. The ones that I want us to hone in on, and we're not going to read, he wrote also, like Isaac or Zerah, a fairly long response, and we're not going to read all of it today. What I want to hone in on, and this is reflected in the excerpts that I've included in the PowerPoint, I would like to hone in on, first and foremost, his alternative interpretation of the Talmudic sources. And secondly, his alternative presentation of the narrative, the relevant narrative, the story of what happened to this young woman, and how that impacted on his halakhic ruling, his reading of the events, his understanding of the events, and thus his halakhic ruling. Right? So again, we're going to first look at his alternative interpretation of the Talmudic texts, and then at his alternative narrative, the alternative story that he presents to that which we saw in Isaac or Zerah's responsum. So let's begin for just right now, let's begin with his alternative interpretation of the Talmudic sources. We'll start right on this page where we are right now. And this is the response of Rabbi David ben Rabbi Shealtiel of blessed memory. I was childish and did not shut my mouth before my masters, and was brazen before my teacher, Rabbi Isaac ben Moses or Zerah, and his honor and humility forced me to respond to a master, and I will offer my part as a simpleton overstepping his bounds. Again, as we've seen over and over again, this is a kind of classic expression of humility on the part of a respondent, particularly a respondent who is really stepping into the fray, who is taking on another heavyweight scholar like Rabbi Isaac or Zerah. My teacher, he writes, his teacher being again Isaac Or Zarah, brought the Mishnah from Perek Ha'isha. For some capital offense, she is forbidden to her husband. And our masters interpreted this as relevant even if her husband is a non-Kohen. And he, that is Rabbi Isaac, wants to compare this one under discussion, meaning the captive woman from Frankfurt, to a woman incarcerated in connection with a capital offense. Okay, let's take a step back and remember what we're talking about here. Let's go back to this Mishnah in Tractate Ketubot. Again, we saw this last week, so this is just to jog your memory. The Mishnah in Tractate Ketubot teaches Ha'isha shenechbesha b'yedei goyim, a woman who was, if a woman was imprisoned by non-Jews, al yedei mamon muteret leba'ala, al yedei nefashot asura leba'ala. If she was incarcerated or imprisoned by these non-Jews concerning monetary affairs, then she's permitted to her husband. But if she was incarcerated for some capital offense, she is forbidden to her husband. Does anyone remember how we explained the difference between an incarceration for a monetary affair versus an incarceration for a capital offense? What was that distinct? Again, according to the Mishnah, that's a primary distinction. In one case, she's permitted to her husband. In another case, she is subsequently forbidden to resume her marital relations. Why? What are we talking about, and what is the distinction? Anybody remember? Okay, so I will remind you that incarceration for monetary affairs, right? The assumption is, the understanding is that the Mishnah is talking about a case where either a woman herself was perhaps in debt to these non-Jews, or had, I don't know, embezzled some money from these non-Jews, and in connection with that monetary offense, again, either she herself had committed that monetary offense, or possibly her husband had committed the monetary offense, and she was taken and incarcerated and imprisoned in connection with that offense. Whereas a woman who was incarcerated for some capital offense is a reference to a woman who, again, either herself or her husband had committed some kinds of crime that, brought upon them a death penalty. And in that context, she was incarcerated. Probably this is referring to her husband was sentenced to death, and in conjunction with his death sentence, his property was confiscated, and his wife was taken captive and held in prison in connection with his death sentence. What is the logic of permitting her in the case of a monetary offense and forbidding her in the case of a capital offense? What we said last week is that when a woman is incarcerated in conjunction with a monetary affair, the Talmudic assumption is that her captors have every reason to take good care of her, because they're holding her in order to get the money, which is what they really want. Right? They know that if they were to mistreat her or mishandle her in any kinds of way, the likelihood that they would actually get the money they're after is much lower. And so therefore, we assume that they do not mistreat her. And for our purposes, what we're interested is in mistreating her sexually, right? They do not abuse her sexually. And based on that assumption, she's assumed to have not been touched sexually, and she's permitted to resume her marriage. Whereas a woman who is imprisoned or incarcerated because her husband was sentenced to death, in that case, we assume that her captors, again, the husband's already going to be put to death. The captors really have no particular incentive to preserve, to take good care of her or to preserve her integrity. And so therefore the assumption is that her captors will violate her. Now, we asked last week, we know from other Talmudic texts that a woman who is raped, that rape does not impact a woman's relationship with her husband from a legal perspective. Obviously, we're only talking about from a legal perspective. It does not impact her relationship with her husband legally unless her husband is a Kohen. Only in the event that her husband is of priestly stock, that her husband is a Kohen, would a woman who is raped be prohibited from returning to her relationship. And that has to do with the special sort of ritual status of Kohanim. But a woman married to a non-Kohen, which is, most people, a woman who is raped, that rape, again, from a legal perspective, should not have any implications or any impact on her relationship with her husband. And I said last week that is very clear in other Mishnayot, in other Talmudic texts. And so therefore, it's a little bit tricky to explain what this Mishnah here in Ketubot is referring to. What is it thinking when it says that a woman imprisoned for some capital offense is forbidden to her husband? Even if we assume that in such a type of imprisonment or incarceration, the captors will violate this woman sexually, that should not render her forbidden, right? Rape is not supposed to have any legal consequences for a woman who is married to a non-Kohen. And therefore, what we explained last week is that the assumption seems to be that a woman who is imprisoned in conjunction with a capital offense is not only raped by her captors, but is even assumed to have initiated sexual contact with her captors. Again, she's assumed to be willing to, take all measures and all steps in a bid to preserve her own life. And once a woman initiates sexual contact with a man who is not her husband, then, as I said beforehand, then she really is not allowed to return to her marriage. Now, of course, the question of whether circumstances as terrible as captivity would turn all acts into acts of coercion is a question that many of the commentators throughout the ages have engaged with. But the basic assumption here seems to be that again, this is the way that the Gemara and other texts explain this Mishnah. Now, I want to remind you that the continuation of this Mishnah talks about a third case. I'm saying a third case because we have imprisoned on monetary matters, we have imprisoned on capital offenses, and in the next sentence, the Mishnah talks about a case in which a town was overcome by besieging troops. Right, so we're talking about a wartime when invading troops come into a town, and the assumption is that when they come in, they rape and pillage and murder and do, no holds barred, do whatever they want in this town. And the Mishnah says, in that case, all women of priestly stock, right? That is, all women married to Kohanim found in that town are ineligible. Ineligible here means they are not allowed to maintain their marriages. But if they had witnesses, even if those witnesses were a slave or a bondswoman, those witnesses can be believed. In other words, if they had witnesses to say that they were not, in fact, sexually violated, then they can maintain their relationships. But it's very clear here that we're talking specifically about Kohanot. The assumption is that when an invading army comes in, the women, if and when the women are violated, that is done in a coercive manner that does not therefore render women married to non-Kohanim in any way prohibited or forbidden to their husbands. Okay, those are the cases that we have in the Mishnah. Now, as we said just a moment ago, Rabbi Isaac Or Zarua wanted to read what he was doing as a respondent in the 13th century, dealing with this case of a young woman who had been captured by local Christians in the context of these, medieval anti-Jewish riots. In order to assess her halachic status, he, like any good halachic respondent, turned to these Mishnayot, to these Talmudic precedents. But the question is, well, okay, we can use these Mishnayot as halachic precedent, but as I just mentioned a moment ago, the Mishnayot themselves provide different categories. They talk about a woman who was incarcerated with monetary affairs. They talk about a woman who was incarcerated with capital offenses. They talk about marauding, invading armies. Which one of these categories is the applicable one to the situation in question? And what we saw last week is that Isaac Or Zarua insists, and again, we just read a summary of his position in the new Responsa by David ben Shealtiel. Rabbi Isaac Or Zarua insists that this Frankfurt captive was in fact like a woman who had been imprisoned or incarcerated for a capital offense. Moreover, he insisted that this Mishnah that we're looking at right now, that the first half of the Mishnah was in fact talking about all women, that is, all women who are married to non-Kohanim, whereas it's only the second half of the Mishnah that's talking about the wives of Kohanim. And therefore, he said, if we consider this young woman like a nechbesha al yedei nefashot, like a woman who was incarcerated for a capital offense, well, it says here in black and white in the Mishnah, she is forbidden to her husband. And that was his main halachic basis for ruling that this young woman from Frankfurt could not, in fact, continue with the marriage proceedings with her, intended, her betrothed in Würzburg. Now, that decision, that interpretive decision, that is, the decision that this young woman from Frankfurt was, in fact, like a nechbesha al yedei nefashot, is going to be rejected by David ben Shealtiel. And in fact, David ben Shealtiel here is representative of all the other respondents. They all rejected Isaac Or Zarua's interpretive categorization. And they suggested, let's go back to David ben Shealtiel, that in fact, this woman was much more properly assessed as like the women in a town that has been overrun by foreign armies. Right, so let's go back, let's read this again, right? He summarized again Isaac Or Zarua. I'm picking up in the, let's see, sort of in the middle of the paragraph, the line begins, and he, Rabbi Isaac, wants to compare this one under discussion, that is the woman from Frankfurt, to a woman incarcerated in connection with a capital offense, that is nechbesha al yedei nefashot. We too deem this interpretation to be the primary one, that is, that the Mishnah is referring to a non-Kohen, as my teacher wrote, and we added proof from the second chapter of Avodah Zarah. So in other words, they also agree that a nechbesha al yedei nefashot is referring to the wives of non-Kohanim who are in fact forbidden to their husbands. However, but with regards to this one being the woman from Frankfurt, it does not seem to me reasonable to compare an incarcerated woman to the one under discussion. Because the meaning of incarcerated is, as Rabbi Hananel of blessed memory explained, it's like a case where their husbands owed money to the non-Jews, but ran away. And the non-Jews went and caught their wives and imprisoned them in the jail. Right? That's a case of nechbesha al yedei mamon. And similarly, for a capital offense, nechbesha al yedei nefashot means that their husbands were sentenced to a royal death, as we learned in the Gemara, and as Rashi explains. There, their deaths are certain, for they were taken by the order of the king, right? That's, in other words, they were imprisoned by the order of the king. This was a legal thing. And because it was a legal thing with royal backing. And therefore, the woman herself could be pretty sure that her husband would in fact be killed. And being pretty sure that her husband would in fact be killed because he was taken legally by the order of the king, she would know that, again, her husband was facing a pretty certain demise, and she herself, if she wanted to get out of that situation alive, should think about all the resources that she had at her disposal. And again, that's the basis of the legal that's the basis of the legal assumption that a woman in such a situation must have offered sexual favors to her captors and therefore become forbidden to her husband. But, says Rabbi David ben Shealtiel, the one in question, I'm in the middle of the paragraph here, this Frankfurt woman, this Frankfurt situation, That is like a city captured by besieging troops. That is not at all like a woman who was incarcerated on a capital offense by royal order. It is a totally different situation, and it is a situation that is much more akin to the last of the categories we read about in the Mishnah, a city captured by besieging troops. Because if you paid attention to what happens in Frankfurt, he's telling Rabbi Isaac or Zerah, if you listened to the reports of what happens in Frankfurt, you would have heard that the attackers set upon them being the Jewish community of Frankfurt, suddenly and looted and killed. This is what besieging troops did to Jerusalem. Some they killed, some they looted, some only to the wives. And so therefore, only the wives of Kohanim were subsequently prohibited. And there was certainly time to impose sexual relations. Nonetheless, the coerced or forced ones are permitted to non-Kohanim, right? Just as in the classic case of a besieged city, as far as the rabbis were concerned, that is Jerusalem, just like in that case, the foreign army came in, the Romans came in and raped and looted and besieged the city and pillaged. And certainly, again, we can assume that they had the opportunity to rape these women. The understanding is that only the wives of, as per the Mishnah that we just read, only the wives of Kohanim are prohibited because this was rape. And rape does not have legal implications for a woman who is married to a non-Kohen. That is what happened, says David ben Shealtiel, in the Frankfurt case. And again, David ben Shealtiel represents all of the other respondents with the exception of Isaac or Zerah. He adds, and this is the last little piece that we'll read from his Responsa, all the more so when they defiled them with impure waters, right? All the more so is this woman not prohibited to her husband in the Frankfurt case when they in fact forcibly baptized these survivors, right? That's what it means, defiled them with impure waters. They guarded the women after having baptized them and did not touch them. And thus she is in fact permitted even to a Kohen, according to Rashi of blessed memory, right? If we know for sure, if we can assume for sure that she was not touched by her captors, then certainly she's permitted to a husband who is not a Kohen, as in the case of our Frankfurt woman. But even if she had been married to a Kohen, she would be permitted. Here, he says very pointedly, in the case of the one under discussion, after they had defiled them, that is, again, baptized them, they were circumspect, they being, again, the Christian captors, and did not prostitute them sexually. Why? How do we know this? Because, in fact, they guarded them for the sake of husbands who would take them sexually in marriage, as testified by several people who gathered in the house of a certain widow, right? Well, how do we know, he says, that the Frankfurt captors did not touch this woman, and certainly that they would not have accepted any sexual advances, and there would have been no reason for any sexual advances on her part? How do we know this? What did those Frankfurt captors want to do with these young women after they had baptized them?
Marry them.
They wanted to marry them off to local men. Exactly. They wanted to marry them off to local Christians. And if they were intending to marry them off to local Christians, then surely they were not going to violate them sexually before doing that. And in a section that I did not bring for you, and in this other section that I'm happy to send these slides afterwards that you're welcome to take a look at, from a responsum, a parallel responsum written by one of David ben Shealtiel's colleagues, Yehuda ben Rabbeinu Moshe HaKohen. The respondents, again, who reject Isaac or Zerah, tell, as I said, a completely different story about what happened in Frankfurt. According to Isaac or Zerah, a young woman was captured by local Christians. She was forcibly baptized. She was desperate. She thought her life was in danger, and so she initiated sexual contact with her captors and thereby defiled herself, again, from a legal perspective. Whereas according to the other respondents, David ben Shealtiel, Yehuda Cohen, and others, in fact, we're talking about a young woman who was taken, forcibly baptized, it's true, but then guarded very carefully by her Christian captors, who wanted to marry her off to another man. The story goes on, these other narrators go on to talk about how the young woman very valiantly fought off these advances of the local Christians. She declared to them that she had already been betrothed to another Jewish man in Würzburg. She refused to accept their marriage offers and ultimately did manage, together with her sister, to escape this captivity and to return to the Jewish community, to return to the community of Würzburg, right? So the whole story that these respondents tell is a completely different one than Isaac or Zerua tells. And now my question is, okay, let's try to make sense of all this, right? How is it that we have these respondents, Isaac or Zerua on the one hand, David ben Shealtiel and his colleagues on the other hand? How is it that we have these respondents who were privy to the same set of facts, right? It is very 100% clear that all of the rabbis involved were responding to the same incident and to the same story that was told to them by this young woman and her brothers when she got out of captivity. So how is it, or why is it, that Isaac or Zerua would have chosen one halachic line of interpretation in contrast to his colleagues who chose a very different read of the situation? And how is it that Isaac or Zerua cast the whole narrative in one light, whereas his colleagues told a completely different story about what had actually happened to this poor young woman? What sense are we to make out of this? And what I'd like to suggest, and I suggest in this situation, but on a broader level, in other contexts where we have these different halachic moves, different halachic readings, different halachic interpretations, and again, different halachic narratives, that what we see at play here are scholars who are really whose rulings are shaped by very different worldviews. You could maybe even say very different political theories, is another way perhaps of putting it. In other words, there's something that these respondents bring to the table. There's something about the way that they interpreted the whole chain of events and therefore ruled on a halachic level that really diverges one from the other. I want to think for a moment with you about the attitude that Isaac or Zeruah's ruling reveals toward the Christian captors, in contrast to the attitude that David ben Shealtiel and the other respondents' ruling reveals about their attitude toward these Christian captors. Right? We saw last week, and we don't have time to take a look at it together right now, but you're welcome to, of course, take a look at it afterwards in the text from last week. We saw last week that Isaac or Zeruah spoke of the Christian captors in very derogatory terms. There are many other halachic positions that Isaac or Zeruah adopted throughout his halachic writings that suggest that he really saw the local Christians, the Christians around him in his environment, and obviously the Christian attackers in the Frankfurt case, the Christian attackers and captors in the Frankfurt case, as really as a society that, as representative of a society that was lawless, that was completely violent and evil. And that is perhaps, that is what comes to the fore in his reading of this entire story. It doesn't fully explain why he thought the woman herself would have initiated sexual contact, but it does suggest that he saw a very, very severe need, a very significant need to erect clear and solid boundaries between the Jewish community writ large and their Christian neighbors, their Christian attackers, And part of the way that he chose to erect that boundary was by really separating this violated woman from the rest of the community. Now, interestingly, I want to argue that David ben Shealtiel and his colleagues actually had a very different understanding of the nature of Christian society around them. And here I want to remind you that David ben Shealtiel and the others insisted that this Frankfurt woman did not fit into the Talmudic category of incarcerated, nechbesha al yedei nefashot, but rather into the category of the Frankfurt incident fit rather into the category of a city besieged by marauding armies. Now, while that reading certainly reflects their understanding of the Frankfurt riots as being extremely violent, again, like a city besieged by attacking armies, that was what the Jewish community in Frankfurt experienced in this case. So that definitely underscores the violence that they understood to have taken place in Frankfurt. But it also suggests that they saw the Frankfurt episode as outstanding, as out of the norm, as something that happens in wartime and not something that represents the day-to-day reality of that particular society. Right? Thinking back to what we just a few moments ago read by David ben Shealtiel, when he said, right, that they were like marauding armies, but they were not like what they did to this woman and to the other captives that they took was not akin to a situation where a king or a lawful force incarcerates someone, man, woman, etc. Right? Incarceration, nechbesha, that's a category that reflects a woman who is taken legally. Right? It has implications for her relationship with her husband, but it reflects a woman who is taken by legal means into imprisonment or into captivity. Rabbi David ben Shealtiel and the others say in fairly clear, straightforward terms, there was nothing legal about what happens in Frankfurt. Those riots in Frankfurt, that was like a war. There was nothing that was normative. There was nothing that was expected about that situation, which again, I want to suggest reflects the fact that they saw their relation, they saw this, what happened in Frankfurt, as being very shocking, very out of the norm, that they saw Christian society on the whole as much more law-abiding on a normative, everyday level than certainly than Rabbi Isaac Or Zarua did. And that is reflected in this quote that we have in front of us right now, this understanding that once they had baptized these women, they were after, for sure, they were after these women's conversion to Christianity, but once they had baptized them, there was no reason that they would treat them loosely or that they would treat them violently. Once they had baptized them, we can assume that they treated them respectfully, that they might have had ulterior motivations like marrying them off, but that they would not have violated them. So again, I want to suggest that reflects a very different reading of the larger political context in which this event happened. And that the rabbis like David ben Shealtiel, who insisted that this woman had not been violated, insisted that this woman was perfectly, at liberty to resume her previous marriage proceedings, that this woman was trustworthy, that this woman had other evidence backing her up, and that above and beyond, again, her own credibility and her own trustworthiness, that the assumption about the society in which she had come into contact was not one which supported the reading of Isaac Or Zarua, that reflects a very different take, not only on the incident in question, but on the much larger and broader historical and political circumstances that gave rise to it. As our time is, there's these responsa on the Frankfurt case are very rich and can be taken in many additional directions. And unfortunately, the time does not allow us to discuss those further right now. But I do want to use, as our session comes to a close, as promised, I do want to use this incident and these series of responsa that we saw last week and this week as a lens for thinking about the theme of this course and the material that we've seen a little bit more broadly. These Frankfurt responsa themselves did actually have a halachic afterlife, right? These Frankfurt responsa were in fact preserved for the ages. Not only can we read them today, but in fact, about 200 years after the event in question, in the context of another series of difficult, very, very violent riots to besiege the Jewish community, this time in Vienna, but another part of the German Empire. The rabbis who responded to that incident quoted directly from this Frankfurt case, used the Frankfurt case very explicitly as a legal precedent. And from there, one of the rabbis in question is Rabbi Israel Isserlein, otherwise known as the Truma Hadeshen, who was a very important rabbinic authority of the 15th century. From there, this case was passed into later halachic literature. It is quoted and it is cited in many of the discussions surrounding the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch that are relevant. And it became a halachic touchstone and a halachic precedent for many future discussions. But that's not the only way I think that we can address this question of, are these responsa that we've seen Halakhah for the ages, right? Did they have a halachic afterlife? Were they quoted by later authorities? That's one way of approaching the question. But I think another way of approaching that question of the long-term halachic, the long-term significance of these halachic discussions also has to do with the different ways in which they might resonate with us in a very different time and place. Many of the responsa that we saw over the course of this semester dealt with questions that pertained to the ways in which the halachic authorities were cognizant of, were in conversation with, were appreciative of other legal systems beyond the halachic one. And I attempted to demonstrate to you in several different contexts the ways in which these 12th and 13th century respondents that we saw, in fact, were very much in conversation, did in fact embrace other legal mechanisms, other legal systems, other legal authorities, of course, when it suited their purposes as halachic authorities, who ultimately wanted halakhah to be transcendent, who wanted halakhah to be the dominant factor. But sometimes that entailed embracing, recognizing, grandfathering in these various other legal mechanisms and legal systems. In order to appreciate that, we, of course, were really looking at these responsa. We tried to contextualize them historically. We tried to make sense of them in their historical moment, because that's the best way, of course, of appreciating how these halachic authorities were in conversation with their local legal environment. That being said, I think that many of the topics that we've seen over the course of the semester, and certainly this last one included, in some cases, perhaps fortunately, in this case, I would have to say very sadly, really resonate today. They really, not because the circumstances are precisely the same. And as an historian, I would certainly say that we have to, always contextualize these pieces and understand the particular historical circumstances that gave rise to them. But the questions of whether it's questions of how we relate to other legal systems, how we interact with other authorities, or in these last 2 weeks, in the case that we discussed from Frankfurt, how we relate to questions of credibility, but really how we relate to questions of power, of sexual violation, of women's stories. All of these questions, again, their resonance for today is, to my mind, at the very least, a compelling reason to really read, to study these texts, and to try and understand what happened in their local context and how it really might provide some kinds of framework for how we think about these questions in a contemporary context as well. And that is perhaps yet another way of answering this question of, are we talking about halakha for the ages? Halakha is, I think, not only about the precise legal rulings and legal guidance, but also about the spiritual guidance that they offer. And that is, I think, another way in which these texts really can speak above and beyond the specifics of the historical circumstances in which they were written. And with that, I will conclude what I have to say about these texts in this course. And I would be very happy to hear any of your thoughts now, or as they might percolate and occur to you in the future. You're always welcome to be in contact.
Okay, does anyone, if anyone
Thank you
has,
so
oh,
much.
Debbie, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say thank you. It was so fascinating. I really learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. If anyone has, oh, I see that Naomi and Richard unmuted. Would you like to say something?
So I thank you. I'd like to add, it seems to me that this is an example of a broader discussion throughout the centuries of to what extent are the Christians or the Muslims, depending on where you are, considered of the Avodah Zarah. Because Rabbi Yitzhak or Zarua goes straight along the lines of all the attitudes and decisions of Masechet Avodah Zarah, in the way he's viewing their behavior and what's likely to happen. And on the other side, you have what people now think of as the Meiri's position, but has lots of other cases that the modern in the sense of the past 1,500 years or whatever, Christians or Muslims should not be considered of the Avodah Zarah, but rather should fall under a different rubric. And I think this is an example. This case is an example of that. Generally.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for providing that broader context. The respondents other than Or Zarah do not directly address the question. Again, the question of whether they are Ovdei Avodah Zarah or not Ovdei Avodah Zarah is not explicitly addressed.
Right.
But you're right that it is definitely
it's
sort
the
of
way
in the
that
background.
The attitude of how they're analyzing their motives and so on is very much reflective of that.
I agree, and I think it also it reflected their own, not only their own experiences, but also their broader reading of the relations between these different communities. Again, be it on the religious, in terms of these religious definitions that you're mentioning, or just ways of interpreting the interactions on different, again, in everyday moments, in these very violent and extreme moments. Yes, thank you.
Any other comments or questions before we close this wonderful session? Okay, well, maybe they'll come later. Thank you so much, Rachel, for the whole session, not just for today's class. And thank you to everyone who joined us today and throughout the session, not only here on Zoom, but also those who watched us live on Facebook. Hello to you as well. Like Rachel said, if you have any follow-up questions, Rachel, I believe people have your email, right? I can't remember.
I believe so. I believe so. If not, you can certainly always be in touch with Drisha and
okay, sounds good. So yeah, if you have any questions to Rachel, feel free to send them to Drisha's general email, and they'll make sure that the question reaches Rachel. Thank you so much again. Just a couple announcements before we end that this Sunday, April 7th at 12 p.m. Eastern, We have the 25th annual Rappaport Memorial Lecture. Rabbi Silber will be teaching on the topic of the Seder ritual and the formation of community. So we hope to see you there. To sign up, you would go to https://rappaport.drisha.org. And again, I hope to see you in one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha. Thank you so much, Rachel, once again. And we will be together soon.
Amen.
Lehitraot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.